It's a very important and admirable occupation. If you have a theory, if you don't have a theory, you're wasting your time. And if you do have a theory, that's fine. Let it be a source of surprise. Defend it as well as you can, but be willing to say it's wrong if you get to that point. But everybody should be working with some set of theoretical assumptions.
Welcome to The Story of Language, an original podcast series about language, linguistics, cognition, and culture. My name is Christian Saunders and I am an English teacher, and throughout this series I will be in discussion with Dan Everett, linguist, anthropologist, philosopher, and author. In this bonus episode, we talk about the state of modern linguistics, including the effects of the replication crisis, scientific fraud, Anglocentrism, and how the underappreciated work of Charles Sanders Peirce might offer a universal theory of how language works. If you would like to contact us, you can find us on Twitter at Story of Language, or you can send us an email at storyoflanguage@gmail.com. I hope you enjoy this bonus episode of The Story of Language. Are you a believer that a messy desk is a productive desk? Because my desk right now is just a disaster.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't know if I'm a believer in it, but that's the state of my desk. I remember I used to have the provost at Bentley when I was the dean. His desk was always spotless, and his secretary would come over to my office and she would say, "Mike keeps his desk a lot neater." And I said, "Yeah, he doesn't think about as many things as I do." He never, he was a good mathematician, and he would write, he would be co-author with people by doing the statistics, but he didn't have like this big research program going on or anything.
Yeah, okay, so, well, it's probably true. I mean, if you're dealing with a lot of things, they have to be on your desk. I mean...
Yeah, and I had, because I was dean, I had a suite of offices, and so I had a conference room that I never kept anything out. So I would, anytime somebody wanted to meet with me, I would just leave my messy desk and go sit out there and talk to them. But when I was at Disneyland, 20, 30 years ago, I remember looking at, they had Walt Disney's offices, and he had a working office and a reception office. And his reception office was just spotless. The desk had nothing on it and everything. And his working office, he had a lot of stuff on it.
Yeah, that's actually a great little idea for any kind of professional.
Yeah, you have two offices.
I was wondering if we could actually talk a little bit about that kind of world, about the academic world, because that science at the moment is suffering from a replication crisis. What do you think of the situation?
Well, I was involved. We had one of the biggest cases of fraud in the history of academics at Bentley. The guy who was ranked the number one accountancy researcher in the world. We got an anonymous letter that his research couldn't be replicated. And so we started to look into it, and we found out that, of course, it can't be replicated. The data were made up. So he had to retract, I forget how many articles, and then he no longer is with the university, and we had to bring in people to talk about it. So the two reasons that you can't replicate replicate research. One is fraud, and unfortunately, that's a problem, and that's not a trivial problem. And the other is sort of half-baked ideas. I also knew relatively well, Mark Hauser. He was one of my big critics, and he used to tell people that I probably made up some of my data on Piraha. Well, then it turns out that he was fired from Harvard, the only tenured professor in Harvard's entire history, over 300 years, to be fired for manipulating data. He was doing research on monkeys, a couple of different species of monkeys, and he had a number of graduate students. He was a very successful grant getter, and he would tell the students the monkey's doing this, but they would have to sign off on the protocol saying that they had seen the monkey do this. And in one experiment, several students said they didn't feel comfortable doing that because they didn't share his assessment of what the monkey was doing in the video. And they didn't think he was doing that, which was crucial to his experiment. So he sent threatening emails and very angry emails, and he did it with the wrong students. They turned him in. And so one day, Harvard security shows up in his lab and impounds all of his computers and everything he had in the lab. And I saw him right after that. We were both speaking at Princeton, and we got in the elevator to go down, and he was leading the critics of me. He was a huge critic, and so he didn't really want to talk much, which made me want to talk more. So I would say, "Hey, how you doing, Mark? How's it going?" And then I heard the rumors of this, and I told a couple of people, and they said, "Oh no, that couldn't possibly happen. He was so ethical. He would never do that." And then he was fired.
Wow.
So you go from the pinnacle of success, a full professorship at Harvard, and not just a professorship, but one of the most famous professors in your field in the world and at Harvard. He was the one who was partly responsible for getting Steve Pinker hired at Harvard. And he wrote a brilliant book on animal communication. And he became a huge advocate of Chomsky, and he's the one who wrote with Chomsky the article on recursion. So right after he was dismissed, he sent me an email asking if the Peter Ha had a word for Schadenfreude.
And do they?
And no, they don't. Although they do laugh. So it's a problem. So for the average run-of-the-mill, non-fraud kind of person, there is a huge amount of pressure to publish fast. And if you've got the numbers, and they're slightly off, there's a temptation to tweak them for some people, or to claim that you have data that you don't have, or claim that the data is almost like what you say. A lot of it is just the experiments aren't that well designed. There's a whole range of reasons why an experiment could fail to replicate. Like for example, when I was working on the grammar of Wadi, Barbara Kern had a series of sentences that she said were grammatical Wadi, and I just couldn't believe it. They were the weirdest things I ever saw. I just said, I've never seen a language that has anything like this. This is just, she said, if you don't believe me, go to the people and find out. Because we were in Porto Velho in Brazil, and the actual Wadi community, about 2,000 people, was, 5 hours by car and then a 6-hour boat right away. So I said, okay, I'm going to go there and find out. So I went there, and when I was looking for boats to go to the community, a whole boat of people from the community came. So they spoke Portuguese, all the Wadis, most of the Wadis speak Portuguese. So I sat with them and I said, can I ask you about some sentences? And they said, yeah, sure. And they were correcting my transcription because I had written them down phonetically as best I could. And they were all literate, and they said, these are all spelled wrong, because they weren't looking at the phonetic writing. They knew how to write their language. So I gave them the sentences, and they said, oh, that's terrible. We don't say anything like that. You can't say that. And I said, aha, I knew you couldn't. And they said, who told you could say that? And I said, Barbara. Oh, well, if Barbara said it, we probably do. Let's think about this. And so a bunch of people started thinking about it, and they said, oh, yes, if we have this context, and they came up with the context, then we would say that. And so that's the other side of replication, is not having all the original conditions of the first experiment. You have to recreate the entire environment for that to happen. Replication is a serious problem in experimental sciences, and especially in psychology. That's where we're getting, in the so-called, non-hard sciences. I mean, you get them in the hard sciences as well, like they were in biology, but with Mark Hauser, but that was fraud. And a lot in psychology, and may not so much be fraud as simply drawing too many conclusions from too few data. I was sitting with a group of philosophers after some well-known person gave a talk. We were just sitting around talking, having a couple of drinks, and another philosopher who was at the talk came in and said, "It's like the banking crisis all over again, leveraging far too many conclusions on far too little data."
Yeah, I mean, it has parallels, right?
Yeah. I mean, you have wishful thinking. Wishful thinking is a serious issue. One of the reasons that Charles Sanders Peirce worked so hard and so long, and his ideas stand up so well, is that he really was not trying to impress anybody. He didn't have a job. he wasn't publishing. He was solving problems, so he had no reason to manipulate. But when you put somebody in a situation where the more experiments they can do in a year and publish on, the more money they're going to make, there's a strong temptation that comes in. In my own situation right now, writing about Peirce, writing about other things, I don't have that kind of pressure. In fact, I never felt that kind of pressure, because when you do field research, you want to publish a lot. Well, I guess actually field research, who's going to know if you make up the data unless you've got other people working on the language, and that can also be a problem. Like I think every grammar, if a grammar is published or an article about a language, and it agrees with our theoretical positions, we don't question it. I mean, that's the practice in linguistics. If somebody says they have relative clauses in this language and they work just like this, and you say, oh, that's the way relative clauses should work, fine, next language. But maybe they don't work like that. I've gone into village after village when I was a linguistics consultant for the missionary organization SIL to help people with their analyses. And I found analysis after analysis that, as far as I could tell, had very little to do with the facts. It wasn't fraud. It was just people trying to act like they had figured it out when they hadn't. It's the same thing with Pitaha. When I went to work on Pitaha, I was told by Steve Sheldon, who was the one who had preceded me, don't pay attention to anything I've written. I'm sure it's all wrong. So I ignored it. I mean, I did what he said. I ignored it, and I started from scratch. And then after I had my own opinions, I started comparing. And a lot of it, I could see why he thought what he thought. But I had very different analyses of what was going on. And so the question is, and this is good for field research, if you have two analyses, how do you choose which one's the best? There's also how to interpret the data. So the first, do you have honest data? Are you doing fraud? Second, do you have reliable data? Did you sort of fudge, or did you miss a few things when you design your experiment? And then another thing is it just wishful thinking? This book that came out, Recursion Across Domains, that Ted Gibson and I reviewed in the journal Language, starts off with a horrible experiment. This experiment is supposed to prove that Pitaha has recursion. And I don't suspect that the guy committed any fraud whatsoever. I'm not, because I really don't know his motives. But when Ted and I were talking about it, I said, I don't think this shows anything, because you can do the same thing in English. He said, no, it's much worse than that. There's no thesis here. There's nothing that can be tested. He didn't do his homework. So in our review, there's a devastating assessment of that experiment, but it was written by Ted, who is, I mean, he's the experimental psychologist of the pair of us. It's what I had thought all along. In fact, I had said this to people. This experiment cannot show what it claims to show, but it was being cited all over because it fit people's biases. It showed what they wanted to know about Pitaha, which is Dan's wrong and the Pitaha do have recursion, but it doesn't show it at all. It doesn't show anything like it. And that's another example of something that can't be. And then the data that they got from the Pitaha, they don't speak the language, and they had flown a Pitaha speaker who doesn't speak Portuguese along with somebody else who purports to be a Pitaha speaker but isn't, who does speak Portuguese, and they had the two of them there, and they they would work sometimes just with the Peter Ha fellow, just through gestures and trying to do monolingual field work, as I have done many times. In fact, that's how I work still with the Peter Ha. Because I speak the language now, it's not, it's monolingual, but I speak the language. But they were getting things and they were just putting them down, and yet they really had nothing to do with the structures they were saying they represented. Yes, these words did come out of the person's mouth, but why would they come out of their mouth? And the other question is, why wouldn't they come out of their mouth? I mean, a lot of times you can't find speakers who will say the thing that you know that they've said. Like I have in my data books sentences that are perfectly natural. I didn't speak the language. They're from my first years in the Peter Ha. And so I know they say these things because these are naturally recorded, spontaneous utterances, parts of stories. And when I repeat it back and I give the context, they think it's fine. But then if I try to create an artificial sentence that's structured just like the one in the text, but use it outside of the text, oh, we don't talk like that. So why wouldn't they say it? Well, maybe they don't say that particular sentence, but maybe it's because it didn't come out of a natural text. So all of these things are confounding factors that can lead overeager people to conclude things too quickly about their experiments apart from fraud.
Yeah, and do you, because you mentioned that there's a lot of pressure, and I imagine that probably if you're in a really illustrious university, there's even more pressure. And it seems that the pressure comes maybe not just from the reputation of the university, but also their pressure to basically make money. I mean, do you think that there's a kind of a conflict of interest between, well, basically bringing money into education is just a bad thing?
Well, you can't do the research without the money. University, whether it's Harvard or Bentley or whatever university, does not have the money to fund the research. No university can. In fact, if you're funding all your research by the university's money, you're basically taking the students' money for education and using it for the faculty's research. And that's sort of unfair to the students. So to do serious research, you need serious money, and there are funding agents set up for this. Once you become the director of a lab, like when I was, to use a very small scale example, when I was at the University of Manchester in England, at one time I was involved in the principal investigator of over $3 million in grants. I had 4 postdocs, I had a couple of different offices, I had a secretary, and I paid for all of this out of my grants. And I had a phonetics laboratory, and everybody had assignments, and people were traveling to Brazil and traveling to Europe to do this and do that. Then I realized, I got to write more grants. And so suddenly, and you find this at MIT and Harvard and all the top research universities, a successful faculty member who's directing a lab is just constantly writing grants. Every time I talk to Ted Gibson at MIT, he's under a grant deadline. He's writing grants, and he's got to support his students, and he has a great lab, and he's got all these brilliant students, and they have to be supported to do their research. So the fact that he can do any research on his own amazes me. So he's doing it.
Well, that's what I'm thinking. My God.
Yeah, so he's there from, Ted is one of these people who works, if it's a 16-hour day, it was probably a light day.
Wow.
He just is working all the time. And he has his students do research. So what you find, if you see a lab like psychology or cognitive sciences, the last name author is the director of the lab, and their name has to be on every paper. So they have these huge numbers of publications because every paper that anybody writes in their lab, they look it over. Ted looks it over very carefully. The idea that one of Ted's experiments would not be replicable is unlikely to me because he's so careful. He looks over every word, and when we write things together, he is never, it's frustrating because he just reads every word and he says, I really don't think that's as clear as we could make it. So yes, replicability is a problem, and I've seen both sides, the far end fraud side And people really suffer from that. The government agencies are basically stolen from the university's reputation. The pressures that lead to success in academia also lead to replicability crises. But in most linguistics, there's no replicability crisis because there's nothing of any empirical. It doesn't matter what you find, that it's not a problem. So that's a serious problem in some forms of theoretical linguistics.
Well, I mean, do you mean because of what you were talking about before, about how environments change, or because maybe when it comes to things which are really soft in the soft sciences, maybe they become more philosophy, so there isn't really right and wrong, there's just interpretation? Is that what you mean?
To some degree, but there's also the fact that if I say that John bought Bill a book is ungrammatical today, I mean, if you go through the literature, there are famous cases of examples that were crucially ungrammatical becoming grammatical in the course of the development of the theory. The language didn't change. It just turned out that these were always grammatical, and now the theory is getting around to recognizing that. And but people strain to understand what you're saying. So it's easy for people to accept this. You get them to accept an example that they would never use. So linguistics is not a hard science. I mean, basically, I'm just saying linguistics is part of the humanities, and a lot of it is no more, even though it comes with tree diagrams and it has what is supposedly rigorous theory, it isn't. I remember we had a physicist at the University of Pittsburgh who was the dean, and he had directed, before he became dean at Pittsburgh, he had been the director of the Fermi Lab in Chicago, and I remember mentioning to him once in a discussion, we want to hire a theoretical phonologist, and he spit out his coffee laughing. And he said, what in the world is a theoretical phonologist? So tell me, what are the mathematical formulas that ground phonology? And he was going into this, and I said, well, that's what it's called, and I'm not debating with you the title, but he had a certain amount of right on his side.
Yeah, I think what's interesting to me is what you're talking about before, about how a speaker will accept so many things as being correct if they sort of if they take a moment to think about it, because like a big part of language is that automatic repair. Like we look for meaning rather than correct form. I mean, like those famous examples of, you read a sentence and it's got the word "the" in it twice, but your brain just automatically skips it. You don't even know it's there.
Right. And so people are charitable to other people. We're trying to understand what they're saying because that's the way communication works. If language is not a computer program and we're not computers, a computer will spit bad sentences out without a moment's hesitation. But humans, we're trying to see the cultural context. We're trying to see the discourse context. And the earlier example I gave of the Wadi, in isolation, they all rejected these sentences. But when they took time to think of the source and realized, she's trustworthy, and it wasn't just me, a silly person, they didn't even know, asking them if they could say these things, and they created the context. Okay, now it's all right. So it goes both ways. Sometimes we say we don't talk like that, and there are famous examples. I remember I've been to conferences where a speaker will say, actually, we don't say this in our language. And then the next sentence, they're giving a sentence just like that. And the whole audience breaks out laughing. And the person just stands there thinking. And I saw this happen in Brazil more than once, but there were a couple of hilarious examples in Brazil by a really, really smart Brazilian linguist.
Well, I mean, and this sort of brings me to, because the main thing we're going to talk about today is grammar. And part of what I'm curious about is how grammar ties into research, and about how research can be difficult to replicate, but also how maybe a majority of linguistics research, I don't know the percentages, but I would imagine more than 3/4 is on what's called weird people, right? So Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. And so I wonder how you feel that affects basically everything that we think we know about language.
There are a lot of people who do field research in all theories. So it would be inaccurate to say that, for example, Chomsky's theory is based strictly on weird cultures. However, in another sense, it is entirely accurate to say that because he built the basic theory on English and maybe one or two other European languages, teeny little things like Italian, you know, and then people go off to test his ideas in lots of languages. The general assumption, if you're doing research in a particular theory, especially when it's dominated by a personality as powerful as Chomsky, is that who am I to say that these data that I've just collected out here in the jungle contradict and falsify the great master of linguistics? So most people will show how the theory can be tweaked to fit it. So in a sense, even though you're getting research on all these other languages, the basic core of the theory is based on English. And that definitely affects the way we look at the rest of the world. When Robert Van Balen started Roland Reference Grammar, his basic question was, what would a theory of language look like if it was developed by a Navajo or by a Walbidi or somebody else who wasn't an English speaker? So he tried to come up with a theory like that. And that kind of attention to real cross-cultural, cross-linguistic differences leads to a more semantic-based theory rather than a surface syntax-based theory.
I wanted to talk about some of these theories because obviously there's so many different ways that you can describe language. And do you think that, similar to the way that physicists are kind of looking for the theory of everything, do you think that there is some kind of like universal explanation for how language works, or maybe it's just too, maybe it's too different depending on the different language?
The universal explanation for how human language works is, in one sense, quite trivial. It's human brains interacting in human societies. That's how language works. But I believe that, and I never thought this before, but more and more I've come to realize that the basis of human language is the signs we use to communicate. And so symbols and the theory of symbols really underlies language, and that's applicable to any language. So Peirce's semiotics to me is the closest thing we have got to how language works. And he's ignored entirely by modern linguists. Part of that, in fact, a large part of that is because he's really hard to read. Not because he's a bad writer, but because his papers were left in such disarray and they're not fully organized today. When I show up at Harvard to go through his papers at Houghton Library, which seems like a never-ending quest. I've photographed 30,000 so far, and I have about 70,000 to go. And then I got to read them. There's draft after draft after draft, handwritten of the same paper. And sometimes they're a little mixed up. So which paper goes with which draft? And that's something that Peirce scholars have been working on for 100 years and more, more than 100 years. He died in 1914. Nobody touched his papers for years. And then they started. Nobody had the energy or the funds to study them. And it's really only been since Indiana University, Purdue University of Indianapolis, IUPUI, Ooey Pooey or something, I don't know. But that's how, it's only since they started the Peirce Edition Project organizing his papers and some early pioneers who waded through those papers that we've been able to see what he was trying to write. Ironically, Chomsky calls Peirce, or he has called Peirce in some other places, his favorite philosopher. But there's nothing of Peirce in his writings. I mean, almost nothing. There are tree structures. Peirce actually was the one who developed graphic representations of language, but it was semantics, not syntax. So I think we're a long ways. I mean, you have to do two things. You have to be convinced yourself that this is the theory that explains it all. And second, you have to convince other linguists that it does that. Everybody is looking at different languages, and Chomsky was able to unify the theory to unify the field. And, it lasted for a few years. It's certainly not unified now, but for the golden age of generative grammar, Chomskyan theory, from about 1960 to roughly 1968, people thought we had solved most of the major problems, and it would just be a filling in of details. And when you go back and read those early papers, forgetting about everything that came afterwards, they're really attractive and powerful. When you read them I had studied some linguistics before I first encountered Chomsky, and when I first did encounter Chomsky, I thought, oh my goodness, this is it. Everything just leaves off and he takes it to the end. Every other theory is just silly. They really don't look impressive at all compared to what he can do. He speaks with such power and authority, and the ideas are so clear and so testable, which turned out to be the problem. Yes, they could be tested, and none of them really held up. There's not a single one, not a single idea from all those years that has held up. People will insist otherwise, but I can't think of a single one that's held up. So we're nowhere near a unifying theory, nowhere like it. In fact, I've heard some people in cognitive science departments say that the problem reminds me of the quote from Braveheart, the problem with Scotland is the Scots. They say that the problem with linguistics are linguists. If we could just get linguists to leave language alone, we might be able to figure it out.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that Chomsky would describe Peirce as a philosopher. The work that he does is very much more like a hard science. Whereas, well, I suppose this is the question: does a theory that explains language, does it become more philosophy than kind of hard theory,
Well, Peirce was a philosopher, but he was primarily a mathematician and a logician. And, when you read what he wrote, the most amazing thing is that everything he says follows from something else he said. It's like this, and he derives it all. He doesn't just throw out a hypothesis and now let's test it. He does test what he's saying, but some of the things he says about language are logically closed. There's nothing to add to them. It can't be any other way. I mean, somebody could test it. You can test it all you want, but then the entire logic of the system is broken, and that's unlikely to happen. I mean, he has proved a number of theorems about language. As I'm reading about the history of logic to write eventually the chapter on his logic, there's this constant discussion about who invented logic, Gottlieb Frege or Charles Sanders Peirce. Frege published his logic in 1879, and Peirce's logic is best known from a paper in 1885. So people say, well, then Frege got it first, although they're both given credit because they invented it independently. I mean, there was no internet in those days, and the mail internationally wasn't that fast. So there's no reason that. But then, we know there's another paper of Peirce in 1870, 9 years before Frege, in which he lays out most of the principles that he then refines tremendously in 1885. So I think it's fair to say Peirce he was the first one to discover quantifiers, like for all x, it is such that, yx and there exists an x such that, the existential and the universal quantifiers were invented by Peirce, not by Frege. And Peirce's system of logic was much easier to use. Russell, who sort of ignored Peirce, Bertrand Russell, and cited Frege, in his famous work with Alfred North Whitehead, Principia Mathematica, they used Peirce's logic, not Frege's. But they had different objects. Frege was inventing logic. I mean, they're both amazing intellectual achievements, some of the greatest intellectual achievements in the history of the world. For Frege, that's what he's known for. For Peirce, that was a sideline. He just invented logic because he was doing some things that needed it. But Frege invented logic to better understand arithmetic and mathematics. Peirce felt that logic came out of mathematics, not the other way around, which made him, but he invented it to study the human brain, human cognition, human reasoning. So where Frege went off into axioms and theorems, Peirce developed something called existential graphs, in which he used the principles he had learned as the first summa cum laude graduate of chemistry from Harvard University in its history. He used principles of chemistry to develop graphs of the meaning of English predicates, and show that this is how any predicate had to be structured. So he basically came up with tree structures of semantics from which you could test and prove your ideas. And they work for mathematics as well as logic, and they work for language too.
If a universal theory of language, let's say that if a universal theory of language was as basic as human brains interacting, and maybe on top of that you have maybe a theory of signs and symbols and indexes, do we need kind of a higher level theory on top of that for each language? Like it could be role and reference grammar, or maybe construction grammar or something. There are these constructed languages like Loglan, right? The logical language, which doesn't have verbs, because linguists need more meat. If they're going to talk about language, they need to really get into the very detail. I mean, we need these bigger theories, right?
Well, I wouldn't call them bigger theories. I would call them much smaller theories. And yeah, we do need them. You need theories of phonetics, you need theories of phonology, you need theories of grammar. I would call it grammar instead of syntax, because it's bigger than what most syntacticians think. But say it's a theory of syntax. Yeah, you do need theories of these things, but they're smaller theories. They're far less significant to the overall understanding of language than the theory of meaning. Language is about communication, and as long as you want to deny that, like Chomsky definitely denies that and says that language is a human computational system, because when he was developing his theory back in the 50s, computers were just starting to be investigated, and the model of the brain as a computer has stuck with him ever since. And it stuck with a lot of people who work in computer science and cognitive science. I think that's a very bad model. But as I've argued in Language, the Cultural Tool, and How Language Began, and in Dark Matter of the Mind, grammar is important, but it's a teeny little piece of human language and human cognition. Whereas in Chomsky's theory and many other theories, it's not just Chomsky, it's made the centerpiece of language. And I think that's a fundamental mistake. As soon as you figure out the basic semantics, then what you're looking for the syntax to provide is how the semantics gets instantiated. And so the role of the syntax is to tell us how to implement the semantics. And this was the view of the so-called generative semanticists in the 70s. The first really big breakdown and challenge to Chomsky's theory, it was considered erroneously, but it was still the general wisdom that Chomsky had vanquished all who came before. And he had set up a new way of doing things. Behold, I give you the 10 Commandments. And in the late 60s and early 70s, George Lakoff, John Robert Ross, Hadge Ross, Paul Postal, Jim McCauley, and others started saying, wait just a gall darn minute here. If there really is a deep structure and the syntax comes from that, then what we really need to understand is the deep structure. The syntax will just follow. And so they used Chomsky's own theory to come up with a theory in which semantics was the core. And so they said the universal base hypothesis that everything comes from the semantics. I think they were on the right track. Today, you don't hear people talk about generative semantics, but the entire movement in linguistics called functionalism, and even a lot of the work in construction grammar, comes out of that original work in generative semantics. And so it's not surprising to see that people who worked in generative semantics, once they've proven to themselves that syntax just isn't that big a deal anymore, they've moved on to other things. George Lakoff writes about politics and metaphorical frames, and Jim Macaulay unfortunately died, one of the sweetest and most brilliant people to ever have studied language. Hadge Ross, who's another one of the most brilliant and sweetest people to have ever studied language, works on poetry. And these aren't losses. They just realize, hey, there's a lot more to life than syntax.
Yeah, well, I mean, not being an academic, not being in that world, I definitely see a lot of, when I try to learn about how these theories might help me as a teacher, to sort of describe language to students, a lot of it just is so dry, and it really goes way over my head, and I find it difficult. I find it difficult to reconcile how a description of language, which, as you said, is so much about communication, how it can be so seemingly, robotic.
Well, I mean, there are various levels at which one can react to that. I remember when my children were studying in Brazil at this private school that I put them in, my middle daughter was studying nominalization transformations in 4th grade. She was studying Chomsky's theory because this was considered truth. I mean, Chomsky said it, we should start teaching kids this right now. And so she's learning Chomsky's theory in 4th grade. I had the best grammar instruction at junior high I learned the Reed-Kellogg diagrams. I learned how to diagram sentences. That's why I went into linguistics as much as anything else. And it turned out it was the only thing at school I was any good at, that I cared about, was diagramming sentences. And all that did, there's no theory behind those diagrams. They would, if you presented this as a theory of language, people would laugh, but there are a lot of intuitions behind them. And they help you. Students need to be able to break down their sentences into their parts to understand the semantics and how the semantics is put together in their language to learn more effective communication. And that's what those diagrams did. And that's, in a sense, Peirce pioneered in graphic representation of language. So there's definitely a role for it. But if you leave out the human side of communication, if you leave out culture, and you try to reify grammar as somehow this mysterious computational system, or not mysterious if you find that word offensive, this beautiful computational system that underlies all of our cognition, you're going to be missing something. And Peirce did say that all of cognition is the interpretation of signs. That's all cognition is. He said, we're signs. You're a sign, I'm a sign, and people interpret you, and everything is signs. A tree is a sign to somebody or something. And so he really felt that with his theory of science, he had unified not just language, but all science. And there is a sense in which he did.
Something that surprises me, because I didn't grow up I grew up English, native English, monolingual speaker.
There are some in the United States who would question your native English, but...
native Australian speaker. So my sort of my viewpoint on let's say the world of languages is was very narrow my whole life, and it shocked me to discover even things that I would consider universal, like that all languages have a word for yes or no. There's most languages don't, or to discover that languages don't even have left and right. They don't use left and right in the same way. They have cardinal directions. And
it's like discovering that not everybody has a penis. There are.
It basically is.
To live in this world.
It basically isn't. And you think, and I remember thinking, how can a language work if you don't have yes and no? How the hell do you confirm anything or deny anything? But of course, there's so many beautiful and different ways to do it.
Well, that's a very good illustration. I remember playing football when I was a boy with all my schoolmates, and one of them, Mario. They all had names like Mario and Jose and Pedro. which already struck me as, why do they have those names? And then, Mario would run out for a pass, and Jose was the quarterback, and Mario would be saying, "Mira, Jose, mira." And I said, what the hell does that mean? So then I knew I needed to learn Spanish. But hearing it, that was the great advantage of growing up in a bilingual community, was you realize there are multiple ways of saying these things. And it used to frustrate me because some of these kids, like, who weren't that great at math, maybe, because and when you looked at their home, they had to work in the fields literally before they came to school. But here they were speaking 2 languages, and that's already an intellectual accomplishment in my book. And I always wondered, how do these people that are so cool and so good at, all my friends, they speak 2 languages, and I just speak this dumb old one language, but they certainly didn't have the same grammar that I had. They put the adjectives in weird places.
But I mean, can you imagine that there might be a language out there, or a form of communication, be that maybe sign language or some other way of communication that we can't comprehend? Do you think that there's a language out there that could violate some of what you consider to be the basis of language?
In terms of the syntax, I'm pretty jaded as to what a language could have. There's certain things I do expect, and I would be surprised by. I would be surprised I would have told you I was surprised that there's a language that doesn't have verbs, but then I worked with Sally Thomason at the University of Michigan. We were colleagues at Pittsburgh, and we worked on the language she does her field work on, Salish, from Montana, which maybe it doesn't have any verbs and nouns as separate classes. This is not something I would have thought before I started reading about Salish languages. Sapir wrote a paper about one of the Salish languages, claiming that it didn't have any vowels, that every vowel that you heard was predictable from the surrounding consonants. So at some deep level, there were no vowels. I think that's wrong, but it was a reasonable hypothesis. So, there's so much variation in the world that we don't see because we're conditioned to see it through the lens of a theory. So I'm not saying theory's bad. We need a theory. One thing a theory does is surprise us. So if my theory says all languages have to have nouns and verbs, and I can't find evidence for nouns and verbs in a language, that's a huge surprise. That's something to work on. That's something exciting to try to solve. Whereas if I didn't have any opinions and I walked in, oh, they don't have nouns and verbs, I suppose that happens. So being surprised is crucial to understanding anything and digging deeper. And you can't be surprised if you don't have a theory. So whether the theory's good, bad, wrong, or right, you got to have a theory of something.
Yeah, but maybe it could work in the opposite way. Like if your theory describes verbs, and then you find a language that doesn't have verbs, well, then you find a way of twisting the interpretation of that language so it does have verbs.
Yeah, and that's the most common result. They're not surprised, they're pissed. And, I'm going to make this fit. And actually, unfortunately, they're the ones who very often get the most publicity or not publicity to the outside world, but they get the most respect within linguistics. Nothing pleases a theoretician more than to be shown how some recalcitrant data that doesn't seem to fit actually fits, and makes the theory even stronger than it was. The world for me would have been a lot different if I would have said the Piraha doesn't seem to have recursion, but wait, yes, it does. And here's how it works. Totally surprising. So there's always that, you can be surprised. And then with your surprise, you can say the theory's wrong. Or you can say the theory requires a little tweaking. And that's how everybody works. Some people work even more extreme. The data need a little tweaking. And that's where you really get into replicability crises.
I don't know if it would be the same as the observer effect, but I'm wondering if describing, or let's say in an academic way, discovering a language and then starting to describe it and creating a grammar for that language, does it then change the language? Because then maybe you have a tendency to become prescriptivist and say, well, I've written it down and it should do this. So as language evolves, as language does, then you say, well, you shouldn't be doing that because that's not, what this language does.
Well, where the observer effect comes in, I mean, sure, if you write a grammar and you publish it and you're proud of it and you're kissing it, my first little bookie, and you put it on your shelf, and then you find some speaker who just violates half of what you said in the grammar, you're going to have to come up with a way to explain that to yourself, and it can be good or bad. I mean, what you choose to do. Somebody else can pick up the grammar and go to the field and say, Dan seems wrong here, but Dan speaks the language a lot better than I do, so he must be right. Let's try to figure out. So that's one way, but the main way that the observer effect comes into play in my experience is when let's say you're working bilingually in a group, and so you're talking to your native speaker teacher, and you ask them a question in Portuguese and say, in Portuguese we say X, and you give the word order of Portuguese and all the bells and whistles of Portuguese. How do you say it in your language? You may get something artificial that looks too much like Portuguese and isn't really how they say it in their language. And so in that sense, you are exercising an observer effect without realizing it. I have argued, and nobody listens to me because it takes too much time, that nobody should work except in the language you're studying. You have to learn the language before you begin to study it to help minimize the observer effect. If you're working in another language, you're getting people who are, trying to please you, trying to make an honest day's wage by working with you, and Portuguese can affect them. Even if they're a PhD in linguistics, it really, doesn't matter. One of my favorite linguists is an Australian, Andrew Pawley, from ANU, and he's worked on these very small languages of Oceania, and some of them are quite similar to Pitaha in culture and things. His advantage is I was reading one of his grammars, and I noticed that his native speaker teacher was a PhD in linguistics. So that can be an advantage or a disadvantage, but in that case, you're basically just helping this person write the grammar. You're offering some assistance, and it's a co-authored thing. The Pitaha facilitate what I do, but if I, and even there, I'll say, can I say this in Pitaha? And they say, yeah, you say it. Yeah, we don't talk like that. But you said I could say it. Yeah, you can say whatever you want.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, how when you're writing a grammar, and especially if it's, let's imagine it's it's geographically spread over a big distance, and so you might have this natural kind of separation over time of the language, like little differences. How do you take that into account when you're saying that the language is like this, if is that natural variation?
That was the problem that Saussure, one of the things that Saussure did, he introduced a theory. He was like Frege to Person was in logic, Saussure was to Peirce in semiotics, although he called it semiology. But he invented the concept, he reintroduced the concept of signs at the same time, actually a few years later than Peirce. Very different theories. There are almost no basis of comparison whatsoever. Up until that time, people had studied the historical evolution of language and variation, and Saussure said we need to look at languages in slices of time. So he introduced the distinction between diachronic study and synchronic study. And diachronic study is this historical study that includes variation, and synchronic study is what is the language like at this moment? And that sort of excludes variation. And that has, since Saussure, that has fortunately or unfortunately been the guiding principle of all modern linguistics, to study language in a slice of time, which means excluding variation. except maybe for a little footnote, that John said this, but I noticed that Bill can also say the following. Sociolinguists really don't like that. They want to study variation, and many cognitive scientists, Stephen Levinson, cognitive science in the Netherlands, said that variation is where it's at. And that is very important. So if you're talking about, on the one hand, there are some things that don't vary. The theory of semantics of semiotics, that's not going to vary. But the number of signs people have and the grammars they have and the sound systems they have, these are always varying.
Yeah, well, so also said that the sign is arbitrary, right?
Yeah, but that's wrong. But I mean, it's conventional. There's no reason that dog in English has to be pronounced dog. It could have been perro or cachorro, or like it is in other languages. In that sense, it's arbitrary because it didn't have to be. You didn't have to choose this form. But it's really not arbitrary in many other ways, and Peirce would have never classified meaning as arbitrary. But it is conventional. That's where culture comes in. You make a list of all the grammatical categories they have. That's cultural. That's not. The fact that Pitaha doesn't have tense, but it does have extremely rich aspectual distinctions, that's a cultural distinction. There's no reason they can't have tense theoretically. There's no reason they can have fewer aspects theoretically. They simply choose to represent the world in a particular way. So they have their inventory of signs. Every morpheme on a verb is a sign. And so you get this recursive semiotics. And so Peirce definitely believed that all people think recursively and signs require recursive thinking. And he said this, as soon as he started working on signs back in the mid-1800s and the 1860s in particular. But he would have never thought that had to be a property of grammar, because grammar is this little superficial interpretation of the signs, and who knows what variation you might get there. So he would have never stuck his neck out, for grammar. In fact, when he first started talking about universal grammar in 1865, he was the first person in the Western Hemisphere, one of the first people since the 17th century France to start using the term universal grammar. He abandoned it quickly because it just dealt with, he really wasn't interested in grammar. He was interested in what eventually came to be known as speculative grammar, which wasn't grammar in the way that most linguists would think of it. It was a very intricate set of logical principles for manipulating signs and reasoning and coming up with how things have to be said. So he worked a lot on syllogisms and the transformation of syllogisms. And then he, very elegant stuff that predicted a third kind of reasoning that Aristotle and all logicians before Peirce had missed. There's deduction, induction, and Peirce invented abduction, which is like hypothesis formation. He invented the first order logic and second order logic, and he worked in all of these things because he was trying to understand how humans reason. And then how they talk, well, that's got to reflect how they reason, but there's all kinds of variation in that. He would have found, he did study languages. I mean, in his notebooks, he's got this entire treatment of Tagalog grammar. He was interested in sound structure. He was an expert on Shakespearean pronunciation. He was one of the world's leading experts on Egyptian hieroglyphics. So he was interested in all these things. He picked them up in a day's reading, but he was up on all of these things.
My God, so he was like a true polymath.
He was probably the greatest polymath in known history. No one compared to him. Not Newton. In terms of polymath, there was nothing like him in known history. I just read a piece of somebody who gave a talk and said that Galileo said this. And a philosopher of science stood up and said, I don't know where you're getting this stuff. Galileo never said that. I'm an expert on Galileo. And he said, well, I got it from Peirce. I guess I'll have to look into that more. He said, yeah, because Galileo never said that. So then he located at Harvard Library. I haven't been to this section of the library yet, but Peirce's 13-volume collection in Latin of all of Galileo's writings, because Peirce wouldn't have read it in English translation. He read only the original. And then in volume, I think it's volume 13, but it could be another volume, he found the passage he was looking for, and underlined by Peirce is that exact phrase in Latin. Peirce wins again.
Man.
He read everything in the original. He spoke so many languages. He was fluent in French, fluent in German, fluent in English, read all the classical languages. If you're reading through his notebooks, he'll switch to Greek for a while, then the next thing is Latin, and this was just effortless for him, like water off a duck's back.
Do you think that maybe he had, he was on the autism spectrum? He had some sort of ability that made him, not just a genius, but affected in some way.
A lot of people have suggested that he did fall on the autism spectrum, that he at least had Asperger's, and he had difficult time interacting socially. He definitely had a difficult time interacting socially. It's not clear to me that we gain anything by attaching a label to that, but I wouldn't be surprised if he showed up today and took some tests and they said he's got Asperger's or something else. We do know that he had a hard time getting along socially. That's why he died penniless. And it's why the rest of us benefit from his poverty, because he just worked all day, every day on this brilliant stuff. Whenever I think of Peirce, I think of Stevie Winwood's line when he was 17 and I'm a Man by Spencer Davis Group. I just sit around creating all this groovy kind of stuff.
I suppose the reason I ask is because when you sort of hear about somebody like that who is just so intellectually capable, especially at such a young age, you have to attribute it to some kind of disorder, because otherwise it just shines a spotlight on everyone's shortcomings.
Yeah, we all want to think what an asshole he probably was, but in fact he does seem to have been very normal in most things. He was quite the ladies' man. He was strikingly handsome. He was incredibly strong. When he worked out, nobody but the circus strongman could lift more than he could. It's hard to measure today what he could lift, because there were different kinds of weight machines, but he worked out regularly. He decided that any refined person should know how to discriminate wines, so he paid a sommelier to work with him over weeks so he could discriminate all wines. And he was very good at wines, had very strong opinions, and he loved the theater. He acted in plays. I've just come across some correspondence where he's talking with the guy who's financing the play, and he and his wife were stars in the play. And so they had close friends. He was a nice guy. He was a hard worker. He loved his wife. He's just smarter than any person that has ever been come across, in my opinion, in history.
Amazing.
I mean, you talk about Newton. Newton was a brilliant polymath, but he spent all of his, when he wasn't doing mathematics and physics, he was doing theology, and he produced a bunch of shit. It was just total bunk what Newton produced. So Newton had these things he did, brilliantly, and this stuff that he did horribly. And Peirce, you can't find that. Everything he did was world class. It was cutting edge. It was pioneering. In almost every field, you have to, his job for 31 years was as a geophysicist.
Wow. Amazing.
He was an astronomer, physicist, biologist, chemist, psychologist. The first paper ever done in the United States on experimental psychology, probably the second paper ever done in the world on experimental psychology. He did it. And William James, who became known as the great father of American psychology, was never capable, because he lacked the math skills, of doing the experimental psychological work that Peirce did.
What would you like to say to everybody out there who is trying to understand language through the lens of grammar?
It's a very important and admirable occupation. If you have a theory, if you don't have a theory, you're wasting your time. And if you do have a theory, that's fine. Let it be a source of surprise. Defend it as well as you can, but be willing to say it's wrong if you get to that point. But everybody should be working with some set of theoretical assumptions.